Well, howdy folks, how are you this evening? Sure glad you're here. I hope you're here for a story or two. That's kind of what we like to do around our campfires, and I know you like it too. Well, like we always do, let's get you something in that mug and something that'll make you happy. Maybe enjoy some coffee or maybe a little bourbon and maybe a soda. Who knows what you're drinking tonight? But come on in and sit down around this campfire and let's do what we do. Now I got some stories if you don't. I'd prefer to hear some of yours, but I got one or two. I just heard this the other day, and I kind of think I'd heard it before, but I'm not sure. So I'll tell it to you the way I just heard it. It's about a haunted cabin, right? See, Ron Weller was elk hunting in the backcountry of north central Wyoming. He'd been hunting since he was a young man, so he knew his game. He also knew it was a good idea to wait for his buddy Vernon to arrive before he set out to hunt. But he thought he'd hike a bit and become acquainted with the lay of the land. See, he'd always hunted in Colorado before now, but his buddy Vernon, he'd just purchased a couple 100 acres of prime land in the Bighorn National Forest in Wyoming. So Vernon, he'd invited Ron to hunt out here on his land. He'd gotten the land for a steal. Apparently there'd been a history of hunting accidents, but the realtor didn't want to talk about it. Vernon didn't care. The price was right, and that's all that really mattered to him. Now, if you've ever been to that part of Wyoming, you know there's some mighty beautiful country. I'm hunted there myself. Ron was anxious to see the views. He arrived at the rendezvous point earlier than his buddy, so he strapped on a backpack, put his hunting knife in the scabbard on his belt, and wore the bright orange vest and ball cap, and took off walking down that well-trod game trail. He knew Vernon couldn't arrive until later that afternoon, and there was plenty of time to set up camp, so he just decided to go exploring, go see what's out there. It was September, and it had been raining, so the woods smelled good. Everything was bright, colors of fall. Doesn't get much better than that, folks. There was a chill to the air, and just a bit of a frost touching the fallen leaves. It was early morning, and the chill wind had forced its way through his clothes. He wished he'd brought a thermos of coffee, but he knew he'd warm up once the sun peeked through the dense clouds. So he'd walked about 5 miles or so through some of the most beautiful scenery on God's great earth, when suddenly he came upon a log cabin. Now, it was a crude affair. It was pretty small and stood back some distance from the game trail. It's kind of in a clump of trees there. A tiny window and a door faced the direction from which he'd approached. And you could tell no paint had ever covered those logs. It was made right there from that wood in the forest. And it was probably the prettiest little cabin he'd ever seen in such a little setting like that. He stood for a minute just drinking it all in. The cabin had every appearance of being deserted and looked like it had been there for 100 years or more. Well, he decided to walk a little closer and check it out. He wasn't the one to snoop around if it wasn't inhabited, but it looked like no one had been here for years. It looked deserted. Well, he took off his backpack and set it beside the door, and with a little effort he pushed open that solid wood door and started to take a step into the house. It was dark inside, and he didn't see the hole that was in the floorboards just on the inside of the door. His foot caught, and he took a pretty good tumble, falling right into the house with a big old loud bang. Well, it was a pretty good fall, and he hit his head pretty hard when he went down. Well, he got himself up and brushed off his jeans, and a little bit of leaf matter got on him, and there wasn't much light coming through the door, but there was enough to allow him to see. It was just a rough little room, scantily furnished at that. There was an old wooden table, the top of which was warped, and it was rectangular in shape, standing in the center of the room. To one side was a little rustic chair. It was a bit tattered, as if animals had chewed on it. Beyond the table was a bunk built into the wall, a pile of old quilts on the bed. Almost looked like they were covering a body. Well, as he walked towards the bunk, careful not to trip on them broken floorboards, he got the shock of his life. The blankets moved. There was a man underneath those blankets. A man with shining eyes and a long white beard. A heavy gray quilt covered all of him, right up to his head. Well, Ron jumped back startled and began to apologize for walking right into the man's cabin. Actually, falling into the man's cabin. But the old man just looked at him and whispered something to him. Ron couldn't hear what he was saying, so he stepped a little closer. The old man whispered the words to him again. Ron still couldn't quite hear him. A small, shaky, bony hand came out from under the blanket and gestured for Ron to come a little bit closer still. Well, Ron took a couple steps closer till he was just within arm's reach of the man, and that bony hand darted out and grabbed a hold of his arm. It made Ron jump, but that hand held a firm grip, much firmer than you'd think from an old man like this. Ron heard the old man say, "You're right on time." Well, that was a bit strange. Ron looked at the guy closely and said, "I don't know you. Right on time for what?" The old man whispered again, and this time Ron heard him say, "I don't know you either, but I knew you would come." Well, Ron figured this old man was hurt or something, living out here all alone, and maybe he wasn't well. He asked the old man if he needed some help, but the old man just whispered, "No, but I knew you'd come. Someone always comes on this day, every year." Well, now Ron was thinking this was just way too strange, and this old guy must be suffering from dementia or something. There was something very strange in the eyes of this old man. There was something very strange in the way the old man looked at him out of those big, watery eyes. He tried to pull his arm out of that firm grasp that held it, but he couldn't. The old man continued in his old, whispery voice, "It's the anniversary." Ron just shook his head and wasn't quite sure what to say or what to do. He didn't feel comfortable, and he asked the old man to let go of his arm. That tight grip was like a vice. It was beginning to hurt his arm. Well, the old man continued to whisper, "It's the anniversary of the murder of old man Crawford. It happened many years ago. A strange man came to this cabin just as you have done, and Crawford took him in. When morning came, Crawford was dead, with a dagger in his heart. Don't be afraid," the old man said. "Nothing will hurt you. It's after midnight when it happens." Ron tried really hard to yank his arm away this time, but the old man's grasp was like an iron trap. Ron yelled, "What happens? What are you talking about? Let go of my damn arm." But the old man just smiled a big, toothless grin and proceeded to whisper his story. "Every year on this same day, some hunter or a lost hiker or someone comes snooping around my cabin. And every year, on this day, old man Crawford gets his revenge." As he said this, he smiled his big, toothless grin, and his eyes got really big. Poor old Ron yanked with all his might to rip his arm loose from the old man's iron grip, but old man Crawford just held on tight, laughing like the devil himself. Well, Vernon wondered why his friend Ron didn't return to camp that night. He worried that maybe he'd gotten lost. He knew the cell phones didn't work out here, so he decided to hike up the game trail, hoping that maybe Ron had found that old abandoned cabin that was back in the woods. If so, at least he would have the shelter for the night. A good 5 miles up the game trail, well, he came to that old abandoned cabin, and he could see Ron's pack sitting on the stoop outside the cabin door. He called out Ron's name a couple of times as he walked up to the cabin. He didn't get an answer. He cautiously opened the door and called Ron out again. There, in the middle of the empty cabin, lay the body of Ron Weller with a knife in his heart. Well, there you go, folks. That's a dandy, ain't it? So, next time you see a little cabin in the woods, think twice about going on in there, huh? Well, let's just take a minute here and throw a little more wood on the fire and maybe freshen up that drink of yours. Get something to top that thing off with. And why, anybody got a story to tell? I don't see anybody raising their hands. Well, I got another one. Hang on a minute. Now, this story was told to me by Ginger. And I think it's a pretty good story, so let me just tell it to you. It's called The Artifact. Now, this is when I was traveling through Colorado about 10 years ago or so, and this is an interesting little story about something I ran across. I was just traveling through a small town in Colorado, and I stopped in a store with an interesting sign out front that said Curiosities. Well, that kind of store is always fun to look around in. You never know what you're going to find inside. It always makes me wonder what kind of stories all those objects could tell. So I wandered inside and I looked through the curio cabinets at all kinds of antique specimens that looked to be the real thing too, not junk made in China and sold to tourists at outrageous prices. No, this place was a real treasure chest, I'm telling you. And I was looking at some old coins in the display case, and I overheard the store manager talking to a customer that was in there. Now, I'm not normally an eavesdropper, but these two were having a heated discussion that I just couldn't help but overhear. Now, I heard the storekeeper say, "Now, I told you that bowl is not for sale. It was too big a job to get it, and it means too much to me." He stuck to his guns, even though the obnoxious customer offered him quite a bit of money for that bowl, apparently. Now, that perturbed customer huffed, and he walked out of the store. He was cussing him, too, when he went out the door. The store owner turned to me with an exasperated look on his face, and I shrugged my shoulders. I said, "Some people just won't take no for an answer." That's what I told him. "These rich folks come here from the city and think their money will get them anything they want," he said to me. Well, I had to agree with him. The storekeeper smiled and asked if I wanted to hear an interesting story. Me hear an interesting story? That's what I'm here for. "Tell me," I said. Well, there was no one else in the store, and it started to rain outside, so why not spend a little time and hear a good story? So the storekeeper told me to hold on a minute, that he'd be right back, and he left me standing there. A few minutes later, he came out from the back room with 2 big old steaming cups of coffee and offered me a cup and a chair. Well, this was turning out to be a pretty good afternoon, in my opinion. And this was a heck of a story, and I'll do my best to tell it in his words. This is the way I remember it. He told me, he says, "Many years ago, I just opened this here store and was trying to find clientele. I was just getting started. So we got our share of tourists in the summer, but a lot of stores around here have to close up in the winter and wait it out till spring. Well, knowing this, I wanted to make as much money as I could during the summer so I could take the winter off and go to scouting for articles of interest for the store. So that particular summer, I was out after snakes and other natural history specimens. You just wouldn't believe the things people ask for. So I had a special order from a customer in New York for 30 snakes. Who knows why, but he wanted some big rattlers, and he's willing to pay a pretty good price for them. Well, I sent him what I could round up, dead of course, and that seemed to please him. He paid for them all. Then I had a customer from Texas who wanted a rattlesnake with a really big rattle, a Texas-sized rattle, he says. So I fixed up a snake for him with 118 rattles. I glued them all together by taking the buttons off and combining them. It was pretty hard to see where they were joined together. It did a pretty good job. And he says that rattle was more than a foot long. Well, the customer was mighty pleased, and he paid a good sum for that, too. Then I had another eastern guy who come in and he wanted an ibex, which he said was found up in these mountains. It had light-colored horns curved up over at the tip like a chamois, and striped legs and eyes that stuck out like an antelope. So he'd heard about the ibex and he wanted one. I told him I often killed them, but they were hard to get. So I said, "You have ibex here? I didn't realize you did." He says, "I'll be hanged if I know," answered the storekeeper, "but there's fellows in these mountains who say that there really are such animals. And if he wanted to have an ibex and wanted to pay the right price, well, I'd get him an ibex, even if I had to make him one." But to get back to my story, this area has a rich Native American history, and that's the kind of thing that tourists eat up. All up and down the street here, you can find all kinds of authentic Indian paraphernalia that all comes from China, the storekeeper told me. It's pure crap. You're not supposed to use the words authentic or native unless it really is, but they get away with it anyways. But I was looking for the real deal, he told me. So that winter, I closed up shop and headed out with my buddy to do a little hunting and scouting for relics. My plan was to head up to the Mesa Verde, and on to Hovenweep and then drop down into New Mexico. And I expected to see a lot of curios one way or another, what with snakes and animals of all kinds, besides all the things I might pick up in the way of baskets and Indian relics that might prove saleable. Now, after being out a couple of days, he told me, my buddy and I found ourselves near Mesa Verde. Now that spot is picked over by tourists, but there's a private ranch nearby that I had permission to hunt on. There's a lot of caves scattered around up there, made by the cave dwellers. And a couple of them on this private property, so they haven't been trampled or molested by all the tourists that pass through. In fact, he said, I think the only one who's ever really explored that area is the rancher who owns the property now. He said the cliff dwellings were first discovered by the Wetherill brothers, a family of 5 cowboys with a ranch in the Mancos Valley around 1888. Well, these old boys explored the canyons and took out most of the artifacts. And after letting out the word of these caves, well, treasure hunters came from all over to loot them. Now it's all protected and there's nothing much to find. There's a few pottery shards and occasional arrowheads that get washed up after a rain, but it's pretty country though, and it's fun to explore around in. Well, he told me, I was mighty anxious to explore the big caves on my friend's property. The cliff dwellings are high up in the canyon walls, and the Mancos River's threading its way through the valley floor. You need to be a mountain goat to access some of these caves. You can use rope ladders to get to some of them, but it's heart-stopping thrill to ascend the canyon walls on nothing but a rope. Well, on he went. One particular cave, which seemed to be a rather large one, was about 300 foot up above some pretty pasture land, and immediately below it were 2 or 3 small ledges. And they seemed to be, sufficiently wide enough to stand on if I could get up there. The foot of the cliff was rough, he said, and the first 15 feet or so we could climb easily to a broad little ledge, and then there was a space of about 18 feet in height, he said, which was smooth and perpendicular as a wall. We couldn't see any way to get an extension ladder in there that would allow us to get up to the next ledge above it. So I came to the conclusion that if I wished to explore this cave, I'd have to come down from the top. I'd have to rappel. Well, he told me that, some of these canyon walls were, 1,500 foot, 2,000 feet. Have you ever been to Mesa Verde? So it's a high plateau. It divides the Mancos and the Montezuma valleys. Well, this mesa is elevated above the valley about 2,000 feet. It rises abruptly from the valley floor and it has cliffs similar to the walls of the canyon. Point Lookout's the highest point of the mesa, and it rises 8,600 feet to the north like the bulwark of a mighty ship. You really ought to see it someday. But anyway, back to his story. It took us a good part of the day, he says, to drive to the top of the canyon from where we were in the valley. But we found the spot and set up our equipment to rappel down to the cave. I think it must have been at least 400 or 500 feet down to reach that hidden cave, if not more. He said it was terrifying. Let me tell you, I'm not a thrill seeker, he told me. I've done a bit of mountain climbing in my youth, but it's not something I do for sport. So as I began my rappel, fear literally engulfed me and my heart nearly stopped beating. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The sheer drop beneath me amplified my fear with every inch I descended. Now, this shopkeeper, he sounds like a wild one. Well, I was a good 100 foot down or so when I started seeing things. If I looked up, I could swear that I saw Indians on horseback, like ancient sentinels, watching me from the ridge above. And as I looked below me, the cave entrance appeared so far away. I felt unbelievably vulnerable. My palms were sweating and I started to hyperventilate. I clung desperately to the rope and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. Every time I looked up, I saw those Indians staring down at me like I was some kind of fool. I knew that I was going to pass out if I didn't get it together, but overcoming this fear was a profound test of my courage and determination. I just reminded myself to take it 1 inch at a time, he said. I was determined to reach this mysterious cave despite the terror that was threatening to paralyze him. I felt like I could hear my heartbeat reverberating through the canyon walls. It was the only excitement of what I might find in that cave that drew me on. This guy sounds like he's got it pretty bad. Well, he said, I found it very interesting that I continued to see the Indians on horseback up on the ridge. I know it was my imagination, but they looked so real. And as he inched closer to the cave, his hallucinations got stronger, he said. I thought I could hear chanting, singing, voices talking, coming from the cave itself. I'm not prone to superstition, and I've never been one to believe in ghostly phenomena, he told me. But there was no denying that I was hearing voices. Finally, my feet touched the cave's threshold, and I felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. It brought tears to my eyes and just about overwhelmed me. The cave was deep and dimly lit by the sun shining on the face of the cave. It's larger than he originally thought, he told me. But as he ventured deeper into it, his fear transformed into an overwhelming sense of wonder. It was just something to really see for a guy that was interested in that type of thing. Using his flashlight, he could see the interior of the cave dwelling had petroglyphs and remnants of hearthstones and rocks carved into chairs. It was as if time stood still within these walls. He was witness to a time and a place that existed just thousands of years ago that he was just so filled with awe. He was just really, really enjoying the adventure. No one knows the truth of who built these cave dwellings. The Ute, they've been there for centuries, but the caves were built long before the Ute tribe came to this area. Who they were, when and where they came from, and why they suddenly vanished, it's still a mystery. He told me he took photographs of everything and carefully packed a few artifacts into his pack, including the bowl that fellow wanted to buy. I felt as if I was stealing, he said. I tried to think of it as honoring their memory, but no amount of money could ever make me sell that bowl. Well, let me tell you, he said, it was every bit as terrifying going back up that wall as it was descending down to it. And I don't know if it was the natural amphitheater that the cave had, but I could hear those ancient voices all the way back up to the top. And if that wasn't strange enough, I absolutely swear I saw the Indian on horseback raise his hand in salute to me as I was ascending back up the canyon wall. That day changed my life, he told me. I felt like I'd been given a gift that day, and I'll remember it for the rest of my life. Well, that little bell above the shop door tinkled, and a customer walked into the store. I thanked the storekeeper for sharing his coffee with me and giving me a good story to go away with, and I paid for my purchase. He told me to come back again, and I know I will. I'm ever back that way again. See, folks, it's the sharing of stories that keeps memories like these alive. Because he passed that story on to me, and now I've passed it on to you, and maybe someday you'll retell it. And that's how it lives, just through retelling stories. Well, folks, it's been a long night, and I've enjoyed sharing this story with you. And let's do this again. In fact, let's do it, well, maybe tomorrow night. But until then, this is Clay Steele. Y'all be real good to each other.